period between 1960 and 1980 was one of the most tumultuous in American political history. Of the 5 presidents who served in the White House during that period, only 3 were elected. One assumed office following an assassination, another after a resignation. Cold War tensions, the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the energy crisis of the 70s all added to a general sense of unease in America. Along with political upheavals, this was a period of extraordinary social change in the United States. The civil rights movement was beginning to pick up momentum, and suburban America was growing at a rapid pace. Even though the United States was the richest country in the world, there was still a large segment of the population living in poverty, and the U.S. economy, which had generated unprecedented prosperity since World War II, was experiencing a slowdown. It was against this backdrop that the 1960 presidential campaign occurred, pitting Vice President Richard M. Nixon against Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy. In the beginning of the campaign, Vice President Nixon had a definite advantage. He had served 8 years under an immensely popular president, Dwight Eisenhower, and was much better known than Kennedy. Kennedy faced another problem. He was a Catholic in a country where prejudice and convention meant that no Catholic had ever been elected president. On the evening of September 26, 1960, Nixon and Kennedy faced each other in the very first televised presidential debate. Those who heard the debate on the radio judged it a draw, but the larger television audience rated Kennedy the winner. Nixon, coming off a recent illness, seemed haggard and drawn, but Kennedy appeared well-rested and confident.
Nixon's problem is that he was far less savvy about television than Kennedy was. Kennedy had already learned that the camera was his friend, and so he had makeup applied before he appeared on camera. Nixon refused to have makeup. He thought it was apparently unmanly or something of that kind.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
This debate not only changed the course of the 1960 election, but it signaled the emergence of television as a powerful new force in American politics.
Because it's Columbus Day, we don't have a speech in Italian.
Throughout the campaign, the energetic young Kennedy and his stylish wife Jackie captivated the public and the press. In the end, Kennedy won the election by one of the most narrow margins in history, and the influence of television may very well have given him the extra votes he needed. At his inauguration, Kennedy challenged all Americans to help reach the new frontier, the name he gave to his program for America's future.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy embodied the anything was possible spirit of the day. One of the most successful programs Kennedy established was the Peace Corps. Thousands of idealistic Americans heeded his call and became teachers, healthcare workers, and technicians in less developed countries. The space program would also become a cornerstone of the Kennedy administration. After Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in 1961, Kennedy vowed to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In 1962, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And in 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon, making Kennedy's pledge a reality. During his election campaign, Kennedy had also promised to address the economic recession and get America moving again. Aided by a Democratic Congress, Kennedy pushed laws that would help stimulate the struggling economy. Yet despite the Democratic majority, much of the power in Congress rested with a powerful conservative group of Republicans and Southern Democrats. They opposed Kennedy's main economic proposal, an across-the-board tax cut that would give people more money to spend, thus stimulating economic growth. They feared that if taxes were cut, the government would not have enough money and our national debt would increase. The Southern conservatives also influenced how Kennedy chose to handle the growing civil rights movement. Kennedy moved cautiously, limiting his actions to presidential orders that didn't require congressional approval. He established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity to ensure that all races had equal access to government jobs. He ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to desegregate bus routes in the South. At the same time, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was involved in helping black students gain admittance to 2 previously all-white colleges. In 1963, pressured by public outrage over televised acts of brutality against protesters, Kennedy proposed a comprehensive Civil Rights Act that would make racial discrimination in public accommodations illegal and would empower the Attorney General to intercede in public school desegregation. Southern conservatives mobilized against it, and Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill quickly became stalled in Congress. In addition to the civil rights crisis at home, Kennedy's attention was also focused on a number of overseas incidents that were a direct result of the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Shortly after he became president, Kennedy approved the invasion of Cuba by Cuban nationals who wanted to overthrow Soviet-backed communist dictator Fidel Castro. The Kennedy administration supported the overthrow attempt as a means of containing the expansion of communism. But when Kennedy refused to approve U.S. air support, the invasion at the Bay of Pigs was doomed, and the incident turned into a political fiasco. Cold War tensions escalated even further in June 1961. The communist government of East Germany, backed by the Soviet Union, constructed the Berlin Wall in East Berlin to stop its citizens from fleeing to democratic West Berlin. When Kennedy did not order American troops to tear down the wall, the Soviet Union felt that they could challenge the United States.
Remember, both of them were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. They were on a constant state of ready alert, which meant that for the Soviet Union to put up a Berlin Wall meant that it was risking that entire balance of terror. For the United States to attempt to tear down the wall would have also meant a possibility of affecting that balance of terror.
In October 1962, the U.S. and the Soviet Union went to the brink of nuclear war over the Soviet placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American mainland. Kennedy's response of a limited shipping blockade instead of an invasion of the island allowed time for cooler heads to prevail. Historians agree that Kennedy's firm stand against the Soviet Union prevented what could have been World War III and marked his finest hour as president. Despite the problems getting his New Frontier programs through Congress, most Americans thought Kennedy would be re-elected. But it was not to be. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Despite speculation about a conspiracy, an exhaustive investigation by Chief Justice Earl Warren and the Warren Commission concluded that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone in killing Kennedy. Historians still debate whether Kennedy's presidency was a success or failure, but his greatest legacy may have been infusing the country with optimism and a sense of hope for the future. In the years since the division of Germany, West Germany had flourished as a democratic, capitalist country, while life in communist East Germany had declined. As a result, between 1949 and 1961, 3 million East Germans fled to West Germany, mainly through West Berlin. Angered and embarrassed by the loss of so many people, the Soviets had East German soldiers begin erecting a barbed wire fence along the border between East and West Berlin in 1961. Soon, the wire was replaced by concrete, and the Berlin Wall quickly became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War, concrete evidence of the Iron Curtain. In 1959, during the waning years of the Eisenhower administration, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba, 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida, that evolved into the first successful communist revolution in the Americas. In response to Castro's takeover of several U.S. companies, the U.S. government instituted an embargo against Cuba. Castro began accepting both economic and military aid from the Soviet Union. In 1960, President Eisenhower approved a secret plan to have the CIA train and arm Cuban exiles, people who had fled Cuba after the Castro Revolution, to overthrow Castro and end communism in Cuba. After Eisenhower left office, President John F. Kennedy approved the invasion. On April 17, 1961, the American Navy landed a group of about 1,500 Cuban exiles in the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. At the last minute, President Kennedy canceled U.S. air support in an attempt to conceal U.S. backing of the invasion, and without air support, the invasion collapsed. In the summer of 1962, to help protect Castro's communist regime, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev secretly began building intermediate-range ballistic missile launchers in Cuba. Missiles with atomic warheads launched from Cuba could reach American cities within minutes. After an American spy plane revealed the construction of the missile bases in Cuba, President Kennedy demanded that they be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. The U.S. Navy blockaded the island so that ships potentially carrying missiles would be intercepted.
Armed warships were there manning the line, and every day Soviet freighters carrying missiles would get closer and closer. Were they going to turn back? Would they try to break through the line? Would war break out? It was genuinely, people were frightened, and with every reason.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
That autumn, the entire world watched and waited as Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba. American ships stood ready to attack. On October 24th, convinced that the U.S. Navy would not back down, the Soviet ships turned back. Several days later, Khrushchev officially backed down. In exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island and Kennedy's secret pledge to withdraw missiles from Turkey, the Russians agreed to dismantle their missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was as close to nuclear war as the world had ever come. Soon, Khrushchev and Kennedy agreed to stop testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, the first significant agreement between the two sides since the end of World War II. But hopes for more progress faded when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Khrushchev was removed as the Soviet leader in 1964, partly because of the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. With the U.S. supporting South Vietnam, the Soviet Union increased its support for the North. Soon, Soviet-made arms and supplies were flowing to the Viet Cong fighters in the South, along what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What had begun as a civil war between South Vietnamese peasants and a small South Vietnamese ruling class had evolved into a Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the time, most Americans viewed all communist movements as an attempt by the Soviet Union to spread communism throughout the world. What's more, many feared that a successful communist regime in Vietnam might serve as a model of development for other countries in the region. Their fears were summed up in what was called the domino theory, which warned that if Vietnam became communist, then communism would soon spread to other countries in Southeast Asia.
This means a big chunk of land and millions of people now go from our side to their side. If we lose them, they get them. and vice versa.
To prevent that from happening, the United States did everything it could to support the South Vietnamese government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was a strong anti-communist, but an unpopular leader who had little support among the Vietnamese people. Like his communist opponents, Diem was not above using torture and assassination to root out his enemies. While his opponents hoped to vote him out of office in the national elections agreed to at Geneva, Diem feared a communist victory by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North. With U.S. backing, Diem refused to hold the elections, revoking the deal agreed to at Geneva. This act only fueled the rise of the Viet Cong. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong had infiltrated villages throughout South Vietnam and as a result were able to control much of the countryside. As the Vietnam Civil War intensified, President John F. Kennedy increased the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam from several hundred to several thousand. President Kennedy also pressured Ngo Dinh Diem to make the country more democratic. Yet Diem refused to fully reform the government of South Vietnam. As a result, his government was eventually overthrown by the South Vietnamese military and Diem was assassinated. Vowing to follow Dr. King's call for nonviolence, 4 African-American college freshmen sat down at a whites-only lunch counter on February 1, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina. The students had staged one of the first sit-ins, a peaceful expression of their growing dissatisfaction with the slow pace of desegregation. The sit-in movement spread quickly to other southern cities, and most blacks remained committed to Dr. King's nonviolent tactics, even in the face of foul language, beatings, and arrests.
The police would use billy clubs and cattle prods, electric cattle prods that you would use on big animals to jab people. Not to respond to that, takes an awful lot of discipline and it takes an awful lot of courage.
On May 4, 1961, a group of black and white protesters boarded 2 buses traveling from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Their goal was to integrate bus terminals on their ride through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. They called themselves Freedom Riders. White mobs and members of the Ku Klux Klan slashed tires and firebombed the buses. Freedom Riders were beaten. Many were arrested. What happened to the first few Freedom Riders, however, only seemed to encourage more protesters. It grew into a multiracial force of 1,000 and gave the movement important publicity. This helped force the Kennedy administration to order the Interstate Commerce Commission to stop segregation in interstate bus travel. During the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama gained a reputation for extreme violence against blacks who organized for civil rights and tried to cross the color line. In April 1963, in jail after being arrested for leading an unauthorized protest march on the Birmingham City Hall, Dr. King wrote what became known as his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, saying, "For years I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." The protests continued. Led by the SCLC, a group of children gathered in Birmingham on May 2, 1963, for a peaceful demonstration protesting segregation. Within 3 hours, close to 1,000 children were jailed. The next day, more children demonstrated. Police ordered firefighters to use hoses to disperse them and mobilized dog units to attack them. That night, national news programs broadcast footage of white officials brutalizing black children. The nation was shocked and horrified. A few weeks later, President Kennedy appeared on television announcing that he would send Congress the most sweeping civil rights bill since the end of the Civil War.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
To push Congress into taking action on the bill, a group of civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people, black and white, from all over the country and from all walks of life, joined together in Washington to protest violence and discrimination in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the closing remarks, an address that came to be called the I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy fell victim to an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas.
John F. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president. At his inauguration, Kennedy told the world that he represented America's youth.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Kennedy's new generation was the youth of America. In them, Kennedy inspired hope and the promise of a better tomorrow.
I've been through 10 presidents, almost 50 years of watching that White House, and that was special. There was a feeling in that administration by these young people who came to Washington that this was a wonderful time, and it was.
Number 35, John F. Kennedy, Democrat, 1961 to 1963, 43 years old, from Massachusetts. John Kennedy would be in office for less than 3 years, a fabled 1,000 days. But in that short span of time, he changed history.
He changed the American political system. He changed America culturally as well. He became the great role model about how American men should look, dress, act.
Kennedy had lived a charmed existence, and it showed. He and his wife Jacqueline looked like movie stars. In terms of the Cold War, the Kennedys were the best advertising there was for capitalism.
John F. Kennedy was magic. I mean, he lit up a room. People were attracted to him, fell in love with him his entire life, both men and women.
Kennedy's sexual dalliances would eventually become well known. But while president, he successfully compartmentalized his private life, including the fact that he suffered from many debilitating illnesses, such as Addison's disease. Kennedy's hidden health problems and sexual appetite never seemed to interfere with his ability to effectively lead. And he did this with an open-door policy.
Kennedy was his own chief of staff. He often described himself as the hub in the middle of a wheel. He wanted people coming directly to him and tell him the bad news.
Among those who came to JFK early in his administration was the director for plans of the CIA. He wanted the U.S. to secretly launch a scheme known as the Bay of Pigs. The plan called for a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro's communist regime. Kennedy okayed the operation. It was a disaster. Even more surprising was Kennedy's response.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
He thought the only way out was to take complete responsibility. I'm the commander-in-chief. I said this.
Following the Bay of Pigs, we have a documented record of a president with a learning curve, a president who had changed his entire method of operating based upon the fact that he bore sole responsibility for the failure at the Bay of Pigs.
By accepting responsibility, Kennedy earned the trust of the nation. With that, he embarked upon a noble and far-reaching agenda to forge a better society.
Members of the Congress,
he created the Peace Corps and planned a war on poverty. And most inspiring, he challenged America to reach for the unimaginable.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This was a huge idea and an enormous gamble. Such audacity would serve Kennedy well during his defining moment in office, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
On October 16th, 1962, President Kennedy called me in the morning and said that he had received a briefing from the CIA which showed through aerial photographs that the Soviet Union had just placed, or was in the process of placing, in Cuba bases for medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles that were capable of delivering a nuclear payload almost anywhere in the United States.
A week later, Kennedy spoke to the nation.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
I've never heard a more chilling speech. I thought, wow, he's saying we may go into thermonuclear war. And in fact, I think we were that close.
A cold warrior at heart, but not a hawk, Kennedy refused the advice of military commanders who pressed him to launch an airstrike on Cuba. Instead, Kennedy kept a cool head and chose a conciliatory course of action in his negotiation with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Together, they forged a peaceful conclusion to the crisis. While strong on foreign policy, Kennedy was much less proactive on domestic issues, particularly civil rights. At least until 1963, when he personally watched television reports of the violence in Birmingham, Alabama. There, Martin Luther King Jr. was leading a massive protest against segregation.
And the scenes of fire hoses tearing the skin off of young children's backs who were marching peacefully and dogs attacking protesters, it changed the public mood in the North and changed the public mood nationally, and it changed the mood within the Kennedy administration.
While Kennedy gained a new appreciation for civil rights, he remained an ardent foe of communism. Late in his first term, as trouble brewed in Southeast Asia, he hoped to strengthen South Vietnam by overthrowing its tyrannical regime. On November 1st, 1963, Kennedy approved the assassination of the president of South Vietnam.
And from that day on, we owned Vietnam.
20 days later, on November 21st, Kennedy visited San Antonio, Texas, to join Vice President Lyndon Johnson at the opening of a new space facility.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
The next day, he and Jackie went to Dallas.
From Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The assassination of Kennedy was probably the most traumatic thing that occurred to our population since at least Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of hope resting in his presidency that he had not yet realized that suddenly people were denied.
The hopes and dreams Kennedy brought with him to the White House were enhanced by his martyrdom, making his presidential legacy grow well beyond his actual accomplishments in office.
The idealism, the commitment to public service, the desire that people should give something of themselves back to America, I think these are some of the most important legacies of the Kennedy administration.
Only 2 men have been elected president while holding seats in the U.S. Senate: Warren G. Harding and John F. Kennedy.